Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mara Rudman, the Executive Vice President for Policy at the Center for American Progress. Welcome to today's event. Before we get started, let me just do a quick piece of housekeeping to say that live captioning is available by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. Now, I'm thrilled to host a conversation with one of our nation's leaders on national security and anti-corruption policy, Senator Ben Cardin, whom I will introduce momentarily. In the past 50 years, the scale and magnitude of global corruption has grown explosively. Financial markets have transformed, financial anonymity has become more pervasive, and the opportunity to graft and hide ill-gotten gains has increased. The World Economic Forum has suggested that the global cost of corruption exceeds $2.6 trillion. That's roughly 5% of the global GDP. The World Bank puts the cumulative annual cost of bribes north of $1 trillion. This level of kleptocracy has propped up autocratic regimes, prompted a race to the bottom for those willing to operate outside the law, and encouraged bad actors to weaponize corruption by interfering in elections or cultivating corrupt relationships. A renewed multilateral effort to curb this level of globalized corruption is imperative. Current efforts have not matched the scope of the problem. Too often, they've treated financial crimes as a regulatory issue or a law enforcement issue, and not as a foreign policy priority critical to the overall strength of democracies around the world. That's why CAP published a report proposing reforms and policy recommendations that we believe offer a fresh approach to a too long persistent problem. Among these recommendations, we proposed establishing a global kleptocracy initiative composed of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union, and other invited members to develop common standards and promote collaboration. President Biden wants to tackle this issue. At the beginning of June, the White House released a memo highlighting the fight against corruption as a core national security interest. Congress also has played a critical role. Congress recently introduced a bipartisan caucus against foreign corruption and kleptocracy, and this year also introduced the Crook Act, which would set up an anti-corruption fund, and the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, which would make it a crime for a foreign official to demand a bribe from a U.S. company or citizen. Senator Cardin has been a chief architect for much of this anti-corruption legislation and congressional action. He introduced the Crook Act and the Combating Global Corruption Act and serves as the chair of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. He also has been a powerful advocate for the Global Magnitsky Act, a tool that allows the U.S. government to impose sanctions, economic and otherwise, on foreign individuals who have facilitated grand corruption. Senator Cardin has been Maryland's senior senator since 2007. He currently chairs the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committee while also serving on the Environment and Public Works, Finance, and Foreign Relations Committees. Senator, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. We really appreciate it.
Mara, it's great to be with you, and thanks to the Center for American Progress for having this subject before us, bringing the fight against corruption. We desperately need a global strategy.
And so appreciative that we'll be able to discuss some more of this with you today. I know you had a hearing this morning where you raised a number of a confirmation hearing where you raised these questions. You've always been at the forefront. And what I'd like to start with, if I may, is a question that kind of scopes out the big picture. Within the past few months, we've seen anti-corruption emerge as a priority for the Biden administration's foreign policy team. We've also seen major legislation move in Congress, including the bills you've introduced. You've been pushing for this kind of progress on corruption and kleptocracy for years. Why do you think we're in a moment where some of this is happening?
Well, Mara, it's a great question. I think it's the urgency of the moment. We saw that in the meetings that took place in Europe with President Biden, the G7, the NATO meetings, and now with the world leaders. The urgency of dealing with the influence of corrupt regimes against democratic states. And we saw that also in the 2021 Freedom House report, which shows a continuing trend towards less democratic states in the world. We've seen for now a decade a decline in democracies. And the startling fact that only 1 out of every 5 citizens of the world live in a truly free country. So it's the urgency of the moment. The vulnerability was brought home very clearly during COVID-19. when we saw that our supply chain was not secure and we were very vulnerable to autocratic regimes and corrupt regimes. It brought home the fact that we have to have a global strategy. I issued a report in 2018 about Mr. Putin's use of an asymmetric arsenal in order to bring down democratic states. I talked about his use of the military. We see that today in Ukraine and other countries by Russia. I brought out the misinformation campaign, and we see that on his use of social media and his ability to silence independent journalists or opposition figures or civil societies. I raised that in the use of cyber, and we've seen that with cyber attacks in so many countries by Russia, including here in the United States. And I mentioned it in regards to corruption, that corruption is the fuel that allows autocratic regimes to flourish and is a real warning against democratic states. It was my friend Vladimir Kara-Murza, one of the opposition leaders in Russia, who said that Mr. Putin steals from the Russians to spend the money in the West to corrupt our regimes. So I think it was a wake-up call. I think President Biden, of course, the election of President Biden as President of the United States, who immediately announced that his policies, foreign policies, would be based upon American values. And when you talk about American values, good governance is a core value. And the most recent announcement, as you pointed out, that corruption and fighting corruption needs to be a core national security priority. So I think there's now a recognition that we need to do more, we can do more, and literally our system of government is under attack and we have to protect it.
Thanks, Senator. Let me ask, in keeping with a number of challenging relationships around the world, you mentioned Russia in particular, we know that some U.S. security partners have problematic human rights records. This is not news. It's not a news flash. It's a long-time concern. The Leahy Law, named after Senator Leahy, one of your colleagues, is one example of congressional intervention intended to force executive attention to those kinds of abuses, to human rights record abuses. Do you see similar legislative action as a useful forcing function with respect to addressing serious corruption?
Mara, absolutely. I think Congress needs to be aggressive. We have the advantage of separation of branches of government. So it can be difficult for the United States in use of diplomacy, sitting across from a strategic partner to raise these issues when there's so many other issues that they have to be dealing with. That's a natural concern. We're fighting terrorism. We have economic pressures. We have environmental issues. There's so many issues that are in our bilateral or regional relationship. So it becomes at times problematic to raise the corruption issues or governance issues or human rights issues. But Congress can force that to be on the agenda. And that's what we do when we pass certain laws. So when we passed the global Magnitsky Law, that meant that we could initiate Congress, the administration, imposing sanctions against those that are violating the basic rights of others that haven't been held accountable by their own country. And the administration can say, well, we had to do it because Congress insisted upon it. When we negotiate a trade agreement that includes anti-corruption and good governance, our trade representative can say, I have to do that because Congress enacted in the Trade Promotional Authority a requirement that a principal trade objective is to bring in anti-corruption and good governance. So yes, Congress can do more. And that's why I'm working with Senator Young and others to pass a bill that would require us to establish international standards as to how you fight corruption, as we have done with trafficking in humans, and then rate every country as to how well they're doing in meeting these minimum standards. And if those who do not have satisfactory progress, they get the lowest tier ratings, and there's consequences to that tier rating from the point of view of our bilateral or regional relations with that country. And there's so many other things that Congress can do. We have another bill I'm working with Senator Wicker to provide a fund available under the Crook Act so that we can respond quickly to opportunities to help countries that are emerging as democratic states. But your observation is correct. We've seen backsliding among NATO allies. And this is extremely disappointing and something that President Biden has made clear that even a NATO ally, our foreign policy will be based upon our values.
Thanks, Senator. My next question contains points I think you have hit on to some degree already in talking about the various legislative actions by Congress. But I'd like to, if I might, tie that together with the White House National Security Study memo that I mentioned and you mentioned earlier as well. So I take that as clearly making the case within the administration for fighting corruption as a key national security issue and interest, and instructing agencies accordingly. How do you see Congress playing a role complementing that effort? Is it through the legislative areas that you mentioned? Are there specific ways to further enhance for agencies what the White House has made clear they would like to see happen through the memo?
Well, there are lots of ways that we can do this, including oversight. Off air, we were commenting about a nomination hearing that's up today for INL in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Ambassador Robinson has been nominated for that position. Great background. But I used that opportunity to raise a commitment to deal with corruption. So raising these issues in highly visible forums and then demanding accountability through hearings and other ways are key ways that we can do this. Again, we recognize that the State Department has lots of issues that they have to deal with. There'll be bilateral meetings with world leaders. Will they talk about this issue? Congress can insist upon that, raise those questions, in a way, help define the visibility on these issues moving forward. So I think Congress can play a significant role in addition to passing laws and giving resources, which is our principal function. Yes, putting money into programs that can help build democratic resiliency in countries, or can act as a club if they don't do certain things. We did that in Central America by conditioning aid upon progress on good governance. So there's things we can do that are pretty direct, but we also can do oversight. And the good news, we have an administration that recognizes the importance. I attended a meeting of the National Security Council during the Obama administration where corruption was raised as a national security threat. But we've never had an administration until now that has identified it so publicly as a core national security issue. I think that's going to help us get the attention of the different missions and agencies that deal with this issue.
Thanks, Senator. And I really appreciate you bringing up oversight and the oversight role of Congress. I think that I say this partly having worked with Congressman Lee Hamilton when he was chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And so I had instilled in me from that point the importance of oversight, and to remind people about the critical role that Congress plays, not only in legislation, obviously, but in whether, regardless of whose party is in control of the executive branch, of the role of oversight in ensuring that policies are executed in the direction that is intended. So I appreciate you raising that.
I'm also a disciple of Lee Hamilton. So we're all been trained well.
Thank you. Yes. So the next thing I want to ask you about goes back to the report that I mentioned that folks at CAP had done. Trevor Sutton, who is leading our next panel, was one of the primary authors of that report. And that we argued in that democracies need to work much more closely in ridding the global economy of dirty money and of corrupt financial flows. How do you see the fight against corruption as linked, and in what ways, to fighting for democracies worldwide? What are the best ways, the routes available to us to make that connection?
It's totally linked. As you pointed out, I serve as chairman of the U.S. Helsinki Commission, the OSCE. The principles of OSCE is that you cannot have a secure country unless you protect your democratic institutions, your human rights. You cannot have an economy or protect our environment unless you have democratic institutions and you respect human rights. They're interlinked. You can't do one without the other. And as I said earlier, when you look at what fuels autocratic regimes, it's corrupt governments. So rule of law is absolutely essential for democracy. You can't have it without them. You can't have democracy. And we have seen, unfortunately, the corruption grow in democratic states where you see a slide on their democratic institutions. And you can draw a direct correlation between the rise of corruption and failure to protect human rights and protect democratic institutions. So absolutely, we have to recognize that we have to invest in the basics if we're going to be able to preserve democratic institutions.
Thanks, Senator. Important reminders for all of us. What do you see as the biggest missed opportunities for the United States in efforts to fight corruption over the course of your deep investment on these issues? And where could we have done things better as we move forward in thinking about what we need to do?
There have been so many missed opportunities. We've seen so many of the population come together. I mean, human spirit is amazing, even in oppressive countries. And we saw that just most recently in Belarus, where the people protested against their government, knowing full well that their own personal safety was at risk. We've seen this happen in more and more of the developing democracies. And there were opportunities really to advance strong democratic states. And unfortunately, we didn't invest enough in the roots of the democratic institutions in these states. And now we are paying a heavy price for the backsliding that is taking place. That's why I reference one bill that I introduced with Senator Wicker, again, bipartisan, the Crook Act, which takes funds from the Corrupt Practices Act and puts that into anti-corruption fund that's available for immediate use, so that when you have an opportunity, there are funds there available that can help assist the country in developing the proper democratic institutions. It goes well with the bill I've introduced with Senator Young to establish international standards for anti-corruption. So you know about the independent judiciary, you know about independent prosecutors, you know about anti-bribery statutes, so that you help implement those changes in a country that is transitioning from a corrupt government, an autocratic government, to a democratic government, that you have those institutions that are built. I think we missed those opportunities. We did not invest much in U.S. foreign assistance for democracy building. We should have done a lot more. It's a very small part of a very small percentage of our budget that goes to international assistance. So we need to do a much more effective job. And we need to work with the international community. There's a great opportunity under the United Nations. I hope we don't miss this opportunity. Through our leadership, U.S. leadership, we were able to get in the Sustainable Development Goals under the United Nations, Goal 16, which is good governance, anti-corruption. Unfortunately, it doesn't have stable funding. We really need to make sure it has stable funding, and we have a global commitment to develop strategies to root out corruption. And yes, we'll have outliers and we'll have countries that will not be helpful. But if we can have it as an established standard of the international community through the United Nations in its Sustainable Development Goals with accountability and oversight, I think we also can take advantage of that opportunity. So we've missed opportunities in the past, and we just have to be much more focused, because quite frankly, when we miss an opportunity and a country backslides, it's very difficult to get it back on the right track.
Thanks, Senator. So much more I'd like to ask you about, and I know that our time is limited. I'm going to, if I can, combine two topics a little bit in one here as we head towards our final question. Your committee assignments, as well as your long experience in the Senate, position you well to be able to explain to us a little bit about how we might link efforts to fight corruption abroad with reforms in our own political system to address corruption challenges here at home. That this is not all an international issue, presumably domestic, and the lines between domestic and international, with your roles in the Finance Committee, as well as small business, as well as foreign relations. I'm sure you commonly encounter the interlinkages. So Curious about how and where you see the linkages between corruption internationally, corruption challenges at home, and then I'd also ask, related to that, one of our panelists on the upcoming panel, Abigail Bellows, Carnegie, is researching how pushing back corruption in the international system will create a stronger middle class here in the United States. So would appreciate getting your take on the intertwining between the domestic and international challenges in this space.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I say corruption and human trafficking, there's some comparisons here on trying to solve a problem. Every country has problems with trafficking in humans. Every country in the world. Every country in the world has problems with corruption. The question is, do you have a commitment to root it out? Is it something that you really are committed by your leadership in order to make sure it does not exist? And I'll be perfectly frank about this. Under the Trump administration, it was not clear whether America was committed to anti-corruption or not. And that's the first administration I've ever served on where that was even in question. So it starts with the leadership to make it clear that corruption will not be tolerated. It then means you have to have in place adequate security and protection against corruption. A good part of that is transparency. Do you have transparent laws? We didn't in regards to shell corporations. We've tried to change those laws. We got to have total transparency in regards to contracts. We saw that this was globally in the extractive industries, and we try to correct that. You have to have transparency in order to deal with it. You have to have strong laws in place for anti-corruption. But some of this is a little bit more subtle in countries that are rated, and I think the United States would be rated as a country that is at the top tier in fighting corruption. I really do think we will. We have an independent judiciary. We have independent prosecutors. We have strong laws against corruption and bribery. We have good transparency laws. I think we would see that we rate pretty high. But when you take a look at some of our institutions, for example, dark money in elections, it's a slippery slope. And it does diminish America's influence globally on anti-corruption when the international community looks at how people with wealth can influence elections in the United States and say, isn't that corrupt? In a way, we do have a system that is somewhat corrupt, and we got to clean that up. So I think dealing with the way that we finance campaigns, the way that we, I'll put a plug in for the PEOPLE Act to deal with improving our democratic institutions, all of that's important for America, not only to be resilient against corruption, but to have credibility globally to establish anti-corruption standards that really deal with corruption in a way that we can make a difference. Thank you, Senator. I could ask you a bunch more questions and learn that much more from you, but I'm afraid we're about time. We're a little bit over time. I'm sorry that I've kept you, but really appreciate all that you've had to offer. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today, Senator Cardin, and for your dedicated work and your continued and very obvious and clear leadership on these issues. You've contributed mightily to what the White House and Congress are doing and taking a more comprehensive approach on this issue. And we thank you for being with us and for all the work that you're doing. Well, Mara, stay safe, and thanks to CAP for putting on the program, and thanks to our panelists. I appreciate being part of this. Thank you, Senator. Now I'm going to move on to begin the introductions to the group of panelists we have who reflect a range of expertise on tackling corruption. I will hand over moderating to Trevor Sutton, who I mentioned earlier as the lead author of the report we've discussed. Trevor is the senior fellow here at CAP and co-author of the CAP report I referenced. He has also previously worked at the UN Development Program and the International Organization for Migration, where he advised on anti-corruption issues. Trevor, over to you.
Thanks, Mara, and thanks especially to Senator Cardin for that tremendously substantive discussion. As Mara said, it's hard to think of another figure in U.S. politics who's done more to advance anti-corruption as a foreign policy priority, and that's reflected in the deep wisdom of the comments he offered today. So, as Mara mentioned, I'm Trevor Sutton. I am a senior fellow at CAP, and I am joined by a fantastic panel of experts that are going to help us deepen the conversation on some of the issues that Mara and Senator Cardin discussed in the first part of the hour. So I'm going to introduce each of the panelists and then take my moderator's prerogative to ask each of them a question or two, and then we'll open up for Q&A towards the end of the hour. So first panelist is Adriana Beltran, the Director for Citizen Security at the Washington office for Latin America. She has done pioneering research on state capture and networks of impunity in the Americas and has been a key voice for reform in the region. Next, we have Abigail Bellows, who is a scholar at the Carnegie Endowment and formerly in the State Department, where she was instrumental in developing US anti-corruption policy there. Third, we have Josh Rudolph, a fellow for maligned finance at the Alliance for Security and Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. And he is a leading commentator on combating illicit finance, especially through financial regulation. And then finally, but certainly not least, Ben Judah, a senior fellow and journalist at the Atlantic Council, and also co-author of the report Mara alluded to that I wrote on proposing a democratic alliance to fight kleptocracy. So since Adriana, I know you have to leave a little early, I'm going to start with you. So my question that I'd like to ask you is that fighting corruption and impunity and improving governance is a core component of the Biden-Harris administration's plan to address migration pressure in the Americas. Unfortunately, this is also a region where we've seen a lot of backtracking on corruption and impunity over the last 4 years, reversing substantial progress in places like Guatemala, in Honduras, and El Salvador. So my question to you is, can the United States help reverse these trends? And if so, how should they do so? What should their priorities be?
Sure. Well, thank you, Trevor, and thank you to CAP for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here today and to share my thoughts with such distinguished panelists, and also recognize Senator Cardin, as you said, for his leadership on these issues. I want to begin, before I answer your question, explaining what the situation is right now in Central America and why WOLA and others have been pushing so hard for focusing U.S. attention on this issue. As you mentioned, I'd start by saying that, the underlying factors that help explain why the security, the economic, and the political challenges in Central America have persisted for so long is because of poor governance and systematic corruption. And it is this corruption that has undermined the functioning and legitimacy of the region's institutions, that have resulted in widespread impunity, and that help explain why so many people have been forced to leave their communities and to migrate. As you mentioned, Trevor, for several years, Central America, particularly Guatemala and Honduras, and to some extent, I would say El Salvador, had led an unprecedented fight against corruption with strong bipartisan support from the US and from the international community. This was in great part due to the efforts of civil society, but also to the support and really the work of internationally backed anti-corruption rule of law mechanisms. You had the CICIG, the International Commission Against Corruption and Impunity in Guatemala, a similar body, MOXIE, in Honduras, and as of last week, CCS in El Salvador. Now, a lot has been written about these mechanisms, about the efforts that they led to strengthen the prosecutorial bodies and courts, how they promoted important institutional and legal reforms that equipped these countries with the tools that they needed to go after illicit networks, and bolstering the investigative capacity of local prosecutors. And the investigations that they helped move forward, working with local prosecutors, really revealed the depth and the extent of corruption in these countries. And it showed, that you're not dealing with just a few corrupt apples, but really you're dealing with networks of very powerful corrupt elites that I would say have increasingly linked, established relationships with criminal groups, and that have essentially captured state institutions and established systems that benefit themselves at the expense of the population. So not surprisingly, when you started seeing progress, you also started seeing a backlash from these groups as they saw their interests threatened and they wanted to reverse back to business as usual. And as you said, unfortunately, when we started seeing this backsliding occur, the US failed to react. Over the last 4 years, the administration turned a blind eye to the continuous backsliding and the attacks, which bolster these corrupt mafias. And what you're seeing is a continued rapid deterioration that continues to this date, that has included not only the closure of these mechanisms, but it has included gaining control of legislatures, which in turn has led to the passage of laws that protect corrupt members of Congress and politicians, that have lower sentences for corruption and related crimes. It has included going after civil society and independent journalists, not only through attacks in social media to discredit their work, but has also included going after them through malicious lawsuits. So in what the region we call the criminalization of activists. And most recently has included, like in the case of Guatemala yesterday, the passage of laws, similar laws that we've seen in other countries that grant the executive greater power to shut down these institutions and to go after their staff for administrative or criminal charges. And it has included attacks to the systems of justice in an effort to regain control. So while you do have, pockets of integrity that remain, many independent prosecutors and judges are in constant pressure. Some have been forced into exiles or to drop investigations. You see increasing examples of malicious use of the legal system to intimidate them. And you've seen in the case of El Salvador, in the case of Guatemala, how these networks have tried to pack the courts. One of the first actions that the new legislature in El Salvador took, Bukele's party, was to get rid of the 5 magistrates of the Constitutional Court and the Attorney General, violating both local and international norms. So, that is the situation. We, have welcomed the focus of the administration on addressing conditions in the region. Certainly have welcomed, the initial actions and statements by the vice president and other high-level administrative officials that indicate that combating corruption and advancing the rule of law will be the central part of the heart of the U.S. approach towards Central America. Have certainly welcomed, that the vice president met with former attorney generals and judges who were forced to leave their countries for their anti-corruption work before her trip to the region, that she's met with civil society and experts, and have, I would say, have been encouraged by the messages coming out of her trip to Guatemala last week, in terms of, the focus in many of the meetings on rule of law and corruption. Certainly the announcement that they're going to create a task force to help with investigation and prosecution of corruption cases. And the support to this, bastions or islands of anti-corruption efforts that remain in these countries. But I would say, that moving forward, I hope that this is just the start of a longer-term strategy that I think, needs to include, well-targeted aid, and that means support for those efforts that still exist in these countries that are supporting anti-corruption efforts. It means, working to strengthen the work of civil society and independent journalists, because right now they are playing a critical role in trying to hold these governments accountable and trying to push for reforms. I would say, though, that more than the aid, what we need are very solid diplomatic efforts, both public and privately, because a lot of the reforms that are needed are more due to lack of political will than technical capacity. And that means that, the administration needs to make very clear that they stand behind those that are leading these efforts, and that it uses, frankly, all the tools at its disposal, and hopefully the tools that Senator Cardin and others are pushing, moving forward on the Hill, to really go after these networks. And I would say that, it also includes, and I hope, rebuilding bipartisan efforts to tackle corruption in Central America, because this is a long-term issue, and, debilitating and trying to dismantle these networks is going to require more than 4 years. And it's going to require a firm commitment by the administration. And that means, that we can't look at the region every time there's a crisis, but we need to commit to supporting those that are pushing for reform, because we saw the consequences of what not doing so can bring to the region.
Thank you. That was extraordinarily informative, and I want to personally commend all the efforts you've done over the years in both documenting and making the case for pushing back against these networks' impunity in the Northern Triangle in particular. Because I know you have to drop off, I actually did want to follow up with another question for you before you go. So you mentioned CSIG, you mentioned Moxie. CSIG was viewed as a success until it was shut down. Moxie, I think, is viewed as more of a mixed bag. What's your view on the future of anti-corruption and anti-impunity mechanisms in the region? Is this something that we should push for again going forward? Should we try to revive CSIG? Should we try to do something under the Inter-American system? Do you think that this is a productive model, or do you think it's something whose value is now cast into doubt?
That's a great question. I think there are many lessons that can be learned from all these experiences. CSIG, Moxie, the CCS. I definitely think, the hold and the influence of these networks is so strong that it does require the support of the international community, particularly as you start seeing just the backlash against, those actors both within and outside of government that are trying to advance anti-impunity, anti-corruption efforts. And that can take many forms. If you ask people now, yes, I don't think there's the political will or the environment right now to push for a strong international or regional commission. But I certainly think that the US, working very closely with other allies and governments that have been supporting rule of law efforts in the region, can take different actions and measures to be able to debilitate these networks and to be able to create an environment that could hopefully in the mid to longer term be able to lead to the creation of some type of multilateral effort to tackle this issue.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, I'm going to turn now to Abigail. Abigail, there are so many things I would love to ask you about, but I think I'll start with something Mara alluded to, and just by background, for those in the audience who don't know, one of the key sort of organizing principles of the Biden-Harris administration's foreign policy has been this idea of a foreign policy for the middle class that somehow strengthens and advances the well-being of the middle class. And I understand that you've been doing some thinking about how anti-corruption fits into that foreign policy for a middle class frame. And so I'd love to hear a little bit from you about how you think that ridding the global economy of dirty money and pushing back against kleptocracy will make people better off in the United States.
Thanks, Trevor, and it's a pleasure to be here with you and with my colleagues on this panel. As referenced earlier, the release of this new National Security Study Memorandum on anti-corruption is going to mean that there's a lot of reflection happening in the US government about how to prioritize a really vast agenda when it comes to this topic. And I think it's encouraging that they're already starting, it sounds like, to think about how to link that to domestic policy considerations. But I think that this notion of a foreign policy for the middle class can be a useful lens in prioritizing across that vast agenda. And really making sure that as the US operates overseas, it's considering what aspects of anti-corruption internationally most advance the needs and interests of working Americans. And not to say that there aren't other reasons to do international anti-corruption work, but that is one important consideration to take into account. What would that mean in practice? As you said, I'm doing some work and research on this at Carnegie, and we'll be releasing a paper later this summer on it, hopefully. But my initial thoughts, based on consulting with some colleagues, is, I think, three ideas to start with. One is increasing the transparency of the US real estate sector. This is an issue that the G7 has elevated last week, actually, but it's clearly one where escalating real estate prices due to kleptocrats stashing stolen assets in US housing can really put a dent in the pocketbooks of American families. And so trying to take on the need for more transparency in that sector. And ideally that could be done in tandem with other allies. That's the international component of it. So otherwise it would just be a whack-a-mole game where we're chasing this kleptocratic money from New York to Berlin to Vancouver. And so trying to have a coordinated approach could be quite powerful across the G7. A second area would be helping US small and medium enterprises compete fairly overseas by reducing foreign bribery. This is an issue that has been on the agenda for many, many years, but I think really adding renewed emphasis within the OECD working group on bribery, and in even more importantly, our bilateral conversations with allies about the need to step up enforcement of their equivalence of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act could really help advance competitiveness for our businesses and for other businesses that are playing by the rules internationally. A third area that I think is neglected and needs greater emphasis is elevating attention on anti-corruption within US global health assistance. This is going to be a huge area of emphasis as part of Building Back Better and curbing future pandemics. And I think the extent to which we can focus on building stronger health systems so that those systems are more resilient to corruption, to nepotism, to leakage, that will really help increase the odds that Americans are safe and protected from future pandemics. So those are examples of the kinds of ways that the US administration could apply this lens of foreign policy for the middle class. And those are just policy priorities. But then a further step later that will be needed down the line is really communicating the policy progress back to Americans, because the progress is only as important, well, it's important in its own right, but in terms of boosting public trust in government and public trust in democracy, if people don't know that it's happening, then it can't produce those trust dividends. And so I think having a sustained and meaningful engagement from a messaging perspective and also iterative dialogues at the local level could be quite powerful as well.
Thanks. I really look forward to seeing that paper later this summer. I agree wholeheartedly with all the points you make, and I really especially want to endorse the one about health and the pernicious effect that corruption can have on COVID recovery and addressing the pandemic. So thanks very much. If we have time, I'm going to try to come back to you for another question, but I'm going to now move on to Josh. Josh, you've commented extensively on the central role that the U.S. Treasury Department and U.S. financial regulators should play in fighting corruption and kleptocracy abroad. We're just coming out of the G7 this weekend, and so I'm curious to get your pulse check. Do you think the United States is making adequate progress in prioritizing anti-corruption and illicit finance in its economic policy and statecraft?
Well, thanks, Trevor, and honor to be with you and the distinguished panelists. I've already learned a lot more just now, and the answer to your question is yes. The U.S. is now making adequate progress, but with a caveat, which is that the United States is, of course, not a perfectly uniform monolith, and so some components are prioritizing it more proactively than others. But I say yes because the message has been crystal clear coming down from the highest level, from Biden himself in his presidential study memorandum 2 weeks ago, teeing up this interagency process over the next 200 years, saying that corruption is a national security priority, and the entire U.S. government, with a fair degree of detail in that memo about all of the different policies that departments and agencies should be looking at, need to step up their game. And we're hearing it from the foreign policy pros who've been around Biden the longest: Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Samantha Power. They're all now, his national security cabinet, and have been banging the war drum in unison about how they're gearing up to tackle this challenge, and they're taking some important initial steps. At state, it's recognizing anti-corruption activists, sanctioning oligarchs like Kolomoisky, considering a special envoy for anti-corruption. I'd like to see that actually come to fruition. But prioritizing the issue publicly. At USAID, Samantha Power announced a few days ago she'll be standing up a task force to coordinate and elevate anti-corruption within the agency, as well as a $50 million rapid response mechanism. At the White House, they're prioritizing the issue, not only with that interagency process, but also with allies, as you said, at the G7, getting them to commit to working together to act jointly on corruption, illicit finance, shell companies, as Abigail mentioned, real estate. So the priorities, I think, are set at a sufficiently high level and throughout the national security agencies and with partners and allies that we're now set up for a real powerful push headed into the interior ministerial meetings in September, the OGP summit in December, and then I think most importantly, Summit for Democracy within Biden's first year. Now, because you asked specifically about illicit finance and Treasury, that's where the caveat comes in, because through the first few months of the administration, we haven't really seen Treasury get aggressive around new ways to use its toolkit. Its full range of tools, regs, enforcement, intel, policy, diplomacy, ties with the private sector and with Congress to crack down on corruption as strongly as it did, for example, terrorist financing after 9/11. We have seen some improvement here in the past couple of weeks. I wrote a piece about a month ago criticizing Treasury's new leadership for never even so much as mentioning the word corruption in any of their speeches or call readouts or tweets. I'm now happy to report that I can't say that anymore because since Biden signed his memo prioritizing anti-corruption as a matter of national security, Treasury has started raising it with foreign counterparts, and you can see it in their readouts, and they're saying publicly in speeches and on social media that they're prioritizing the mission. Now, in terms of the details that they say that they're prioritizing, they're basically, it's a couple of things. It's implementing some important laws that Congress passed a couple of months ago, like beneficial ownership reform and a kleptocracy assets reward program, or they're things that they point to things that they're already doing, like sanctions or geographic targeting orders, as they currently are rolling over every 6 months. And so, Biden's memo and the press guidance around it specifically said that this 200-day process is going to have to extend beyond things that departments and agencies are already doing. And so for Treasury specifically, a more ambitious agenda was recommended about a month ago in a letter from Senator Whitehouse and Rep. Tom Malinowski, urging steps like regulating private equity and hedge funds, pushing for the first ever national corruption risk assessment to guide bank compliance, developing a medium-term plan that addresses offshore financial secrecy, real estate, trusts and foundations, cross-border payment. There's a lot that they can do, and have to bring in some folks or designate high-level personnel to coordinate that mission. That's what I really want to see. But yeah, with a president who really gets this stuff deep in his bones and all of this momentum like we've never seen before, frankly, over the past couple of weeks, I'm optimistic that we're going to get there.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I agree with you. It's really very heady times for the sort of anti-corruption advocacy world in a way that is almost whiplash, for those of us like yourself who have been advocating for robust action for quite a while. Suddenly we're finally seeing movement in this, and it's quite exhilarating. Great. Well, finally, last but not least, certainly, Ben, you and I have written together about the need for democracies to dramatically deepen cooperation in fighting corruption. And, I want to point out that today is the US-EU summit. And so I wanted to ask you specifically about the transatlantic relationship. How can Washington and the EU and Brussels, support and push each other to do more to fight graft in the international system and in their own economies?
Thank you so much for having me. And I'd first like to kind of share, how much I've learned from the other panelists today, and really salute Senator Cardin's leadership on this issue. So to answer your question about what could the US and the EU do together on this day, which is the day of the US-EU summit, I think the best place to begin is to ask, why should this really be a priority? And one of the principles that we outlined in our report is that there is a democratic advantage that the leading democracies have over the global financial system, which is they still remain hegemonic over it. It's just a kind of key statistic which is worth knowing, is that the dollar and the euro account for 3/4 of cross-border transactions. If one brings in the pound and the yen, that soars to 85%. So there's already a basis there that we need to operationalize and really work together on. And there is some positive news, which is there has been over the last few years an element of regulatory convergence over key anti-corruption measures in the UK, in the EU, and in the US. So what would this look like? In the report that we co-authored, we suggested the idea of a global kleptocracy initiative. And the idea is that this would be an informal cooperation structure modeled to some extent off the Proliferation Security Initiative of 2003, built perhaps around a declaration of principles and regular channels to kind of update and coordinate, but not a new international institution. So what could that look like? What are the key components that could have? So here are a few of them that we've identified as being very important. The first is to really kind of advance a common set of anti-money laundering standards worldwide. You know, there is a lot of divergence now between the three major Atlantic powers in the financial world, and that we should work to coordinate those to create a common floor. There should be a pledge to properly resource law enforcement going after illicit finance amongst all members of the GKI, as we've called it, because currently we have a situation where some countries, and I'm in particular looking at my own home country, the United Kingdom, have got on the books really quite impressive sets of laws, but they haven't really been enforcing them. Another kind of key component we've identified, and this perhaps could be the trickiest because of things like GDPR, is to automate and reduce friction when it comes to information exchange. Currently, it's quite time consuming. It's often very tricky to get information shared on active cases between partner countries. And that's an area where we could do a lot of work to cut through and make things speedier. And that could include increasing access to FATCA and CRS tax data, which would be extremely useful for law enforcement on both sides of the Atlantic to go after the kleptocrats. You know, then there are a whole series of prioritizations that we can commit to in our national security strategies. As the US is going through this 200-day process that the distinguished panelists were talking about, a global kleptocracy initiative would be a chance to ensure that a lot of those principles and those discussions are being shared. That can include making sure that corruption's not deprioritized in favor of other policy areas in partner countries. That can include making sure that it was prioritized in new national security documents, and that there were also a series of measures with summits and with regular diplomatic cooperation to coordinate a lot of key diplomatic tools. Those could be some of the coercive tools, such as sanctions on oligarchs, that Josh was talking about. We could really do a lot to coordinate there on both sides of the Atlantic. There could be common measures to get rid of golden visas, which we know on both sides of the Atlantic have been used to allow kleptocrats to enter different countries and thus enter their financial systems. And we could do more to align investment screening, really begin a conversation about how does corruption and kleptocracy feature in that, and do a lot to coordinate internationally in the sort of regular summitry. Hopefully it's going to be a lot more regular than it has been over the last year going forward, with view to what Senator Cardin mentioned as the United Nations, making sure that we present a common democratic front. So those are some of the kind of more technical ways that we could cooperate, but it's also a matter of kind of attitude and spirit. And I think this would be where I'd like to close, which is that currently the European Union is trying to build a European anti-money laundering agency. There are various countries in Europe which are America's partners on security issues, to whom America is a security provider, which have been kind of intransigent or blocking this as it goes through the process. US diplomats from the president down should be very loud and clear at events like the one that's happening today, that the US backs a common EU anti-money laundering agency and views that as actually a core national security objective of its own. Now, here in the United States and in Washington, I think there could be a change in attitude from European diplomats as well. We hear loud and clear from European diplomats when they want specific measures taken to do with weapons systems or defense or NATO, which they view as part of their national security. It would be good to hear from them when the US passes anti-corruption measures, that they view these as really helpful to European national security. I'm thinking of measures like the Crook Act and so on. And finally, one of the big things that's happening today is the beginning of the EU-US Tech and Trade Council. It would be very good for us to start working to have corruption included as a regular topic, as it is very much part of the tech and trade interrelationships that we have both with each other and globally. So that's where I begin. It's a long, but hopefully not too long shopping list for our leaders to go after.
Great. And so we've almost used up all of our time, so we only have a little time for audience Q&A. But I did want to flag two questions that any of you can take up. First question from the audience relates to U.S. policy towards Russia, and the question essentially notes that Russia has effectively weaponized corruption to advance its interests and potentially undermine those of democratic countries, including the United States. And so the question is, how do we effectively push back against that weaponized corruption without unnecessarily escalating tensions with Russia? And so, Josh, Ben, that seems like a question you guys could weigh in on. And just for the sake of time, the second question, which I think Abigail might be especially well positioned to answer, notes that the situation described in the Northern Triangle seems eerily similar to current trends in Mexico. And then asks, how can the US government work simultaneously with government and civil society organizations to push anti-corruption initiatives in the face of pushback against current progress against impunity? And so, Abigail, I know you've written a bit about working with civil society organizations. So those I think, the two questions we have time for, so I'll throw it open to the panel.
I'll just answer the question on Russia very quickly. It's important to remember that the Russian state presents itself to its people as an anti-corruption actor. Putin talks about himself as a historic Russian anti-corruption actor going back to the late 1990s. And there's a lot of demand amongst the Russian people for action to be taken against corruption. This is a major problem for the Kremlin. So the Kremlin doesn't like being presented as an anti-corruption force domestically, but it has to present itself as one that's committed to clean government. This is not an issue where if the United States pushes, there's going to be pushback from Russian domestic public opinion, such as there is on issues like Crimea. This is one that's a little bit more tricky for the Kremlin to navigate, and one where it's unlikely that it's going to antagonize them, at least publicly.
And then I'll just add on that question that the biggest thing we need to do to be able to stand up to Russia on anything, but in particular on these issues, is to get the allies back together and strong and united. And there's a few things that go into that. And I think it's things that the administration has been prioritizing in recent months. First, starting with unity at home, and then, as you're seeing this week, unity with the alliance, within the alliance structures, building resilience with the policies that we saw the administration starting to tee up last week, and then supporting in, for example, the G7 this week, and showing that the allies and democracies can do big things together. The biggest thing, frankly, the biggest thing this week, I think, that positions the democracies to be strong and standing up to autocracies is sending 1 billion vaccines around the world and changing the game of the way that the democracies are able to solve big problems and be seen as doing so. That is as important as anything for standing up to autocracies and strategic corruption.
And I'll jump in on the assistance question. I think in these contexts where there is entrenched corruption in many domains, it's important for the US to be clear about what type of corruption is causing most harm to US interests, and getting beyond a pat zero tolerance approach into really specific elements of corruption that are going to be tackled, whether it's drug smuggling and the kind of corruption harms that are feeding that, or those that are feeding into the migration challenges or business competitiveness. So get specific, get the diagnosis right. Why is this kind of corruption happening? And what is really the root cause of it? Is it really about greed? Is it about need? Is it strategic corruption, about influencing foreign countries, as we've just heard, and then getting the strategies right. So in the context where there's mixed political will, let's say, as with the Northern Triangle countries in Mexico, focusing on increasing government capacity in the units where there are reformers in the lead, where there's real alignment on goals. And that could be at the subnational level even. It doesn't even necessarily need to be at the national level, but there might be certain ministries or certain units where there is a lot of political will. Building broader demand for reform. So that's bucking up civil society and investigative journalists, also deterring spoilers through sanctions and other steps, and sending the message that the United States stands with those citizens. And then finally, activating other partners so that it's not the US acting alone, but really in concert with other governments, with multilateral mechanisms, like we heard in terms of the role of the Inter-American mechanisms. And through those steps, it can both shore up the credibility of US action, but it also helps sustain momentum across political transitions and hedges against the potential that the US administration will shift priorities in the future and cannot lead on this alone, but really has to be part of a broader effort with other countries.
Thanks, Abigail. And yeah, that last point about hoping that future U.S. administrations remain as committed to anti-corruption as this one is definitely a key one, and we can all have our fingers crossed. So I think we've turned into a pumpkin here. It's a little bit past 1. I want to once again thank all our panelists for just a superb discussion, and this has really been a really great event at a crucial moment for U.S. Global anti-corruption efforts. So I would encourage everyone in the audience to follow the panelists. I think they'll all be producing more interesting work in the space, and we likely will be hosting another event at some point this year. So we hope you'll join us for that. And with that, I will end the meeting and hope that the rest of you had a safe and happy day. Take care.